Hey everyone, and welcome to the Monetize Your Expertise podcast. I'm your host, Grant Weherley, the online course guy helping you every week to monetize your expertise. Just go to myepodcast.com for tools and links and more for all episodes. Hey podcast listeners, and welcome to the Monetize Your Expertise podcast. Today I'm here with Thomas Smale, the founder of FE International, a massive online business brokerage company that's executed over 300 industry-leading transactions at up to 7 figures. He's a true expert on buying and selling online businesses. So thanks for joining me today, Thomas.
Thanks very much, Grant.
So tell me a bit about your background and how you got started and how that led to where you currently are.
Yeah, so my background was, I was at university. I think like most students didn't really have any money, so I was looking for a way to make some extra cash. So at the time, I was trying lots of different things. One of the things that worked quite well for me was buying websites and then reselling them for a profit. And then off the back of that, I wrote or co-authored an ebook in 2010 on buying and selling websites, which did quite well at the time. We made a bunch of sales, managed to kind of never have to get a day job, go straight from university into working for myself full time. And then off the back of that, people started coming to me saying, hey, I read your book, it's great, but can you help me sell my business? So from there, I started helping people, and I guess accidentally fell into the business brokerage world where people would let me sell their business and I would take a percentage. And then I've kind of scaled it up from there, just continue to grow and grow and grow. More people coming in, clearly a lot of demand for it. So that's what I stuck with in the end.
Great stuff. It's always a good situation when you have people coming to you saying, hey, can I pay you money to help me do this?
Yeah, certainly makes it.
And so it sounds like the book helped position you as the authority on that topic. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say that's a pretty good way to look at it.
Nice. And so I did introduce you, but is there anything that you'd like to add and share with listeners today about who you are, what you're working on, what you're about?
So at the moment, I guess it's not really about me these days. We've got a team of 10. We've got offices in 2 different countries and we're continually growing. So starting out, obviously, I think a lot of people out there are still like a one-man band, or maybe they have a business partner. But when you get to the stage I'm at now, there's 10 of us, and we're kind of only hiring. So the sort of challenges I have become less about me and like more about the team and what everyone is working on. So I think that's quite an important thing to distinguish. You see a lot of successful people, but really it's the team. Once you get to the stage where there's like 10 people, there's no one person who kind of does it all. So I guess I'm lucky that I can leverage my personal expertise in buying and selling. I've got a team around me that can kind of also do that and deliver a service that's much higher quality than I could myself.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really good point there, that what you're currently doing is unsustainable or not even possible without your team. So how long did it take you to build up to that point? Like, how long have you been working on your current business? And did you start by yourself or did you start with the team?
I started with an original business partner in 2010, and there was just 2 of us. And then in 2012, my current business partner came in and took over from him. We hired our first employee. So we started in May 2010, hired first employee in March 2011. So it took about 12 months. I mean, we'd hired like freelancers and things like that, but the first full-time employees came then. And that's when we sold our first website we owned for 5 figures. So we reinvested most of the cash into the rent of an office and employees. And then since when my current business partner joined in 2012, there was only 4 or 5 of us, and we've kind of slowly hired from there to get to the stage where there's 10 of us today. And we're currently hiring at the moment to probably get to 12 or 13 quite soon.
Nice. And it sounds like you've been through several stages of growth. And I imagine what your business and what your lifestyle looked like at the various stages and the challenges you faced probably varied dramatically at each stage. Would you agree with that? Yeah,
no, the challenges certainly change. I think especially as a business owner, challenges are kind of more around like hiring and systems and processes rather than how to do the service. I think you spend the first couple of years trying to figure out what you're doing and how to do it. But we're now at the stage where our service offer, the one thing that's been consistent throughout the years is the service. I mean, we improve it constantly, but the actual process itself has always ultimately been the same thing, which is selling someone's business.
Yeah, you hit on a really great point, and I think that's maybe a distinction that takes some time to see because I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs who they have a business, but then they've never really flipped that switch to go from sort of fulfilling that service to being the business owner and focusing on things like building the team and building the systems. But it seems like that is one of the major transitions throughout a business's life cycle. So what did you learn through that first big step of, I guess, ironing out the process of actually fulfilling the service? Was there any major realizations that you had either about your business specifically or the way you guys worked to actually fulfill it?
I think in general, I was always quite adamant that there was no way to systemize a service that's quite varied because obviously every business is different. But one of the things I learned identified quite early on is that my personal skills were not enough to build the business to where it needs to be. So part of the reason I brought a business partner in 2012, who was a friend from university, and this one was kind of running the company now. He's a lot more system and process focused than I am. And I guess my expertise is more in the actual selling of sites in the first place. So we have quite a good crossover between the two of us, which I think is important. But in terms of challenges, it's just kind of constantly improving a service that can be delivered by multiple people across the team. Because if it's just me doing it, then it's fine because I have my process and my system. But when you've got a team of people doing that, you need everyone to follow the same processes, which should take some time. But we're lucky that we've got a good brokerage team in David and James who I guess do a lot of things a lot better than I could do myself. So that certainly helps.
You know, it's funny, since the very first interview that I've had for this podcast, one of the most consistent lessons learned and important things that the entrepreneurs share, which isn't, I realized it was important, but it's crazy how consistently true this advice is in all of the different industries of people I've interviewed. People always emphasize how if they're really successful, it's only because they're in a really good team, and that's enabled them to really sort of exponentially kick it up a notch, and they couldn't have done it without a team. Like since the very first interview I did, that's what we talked about a lot, and it's crazy how important that is, and I think that's a really important lesson to talk about. There was one very specific industry question that I wanted to ask you about what you do and your expertise, because I've just sort of observed the types of businesses that are sold or people try to sell, or the whole concept of like exiting businesses and stuff. It's always in a lot of people's minds, and so I'm curious what your thoughts about the saleability of a business. What are the top characteristics that tell you that a business is easy to be sold or should be sold, especially going into it from the beginning? Are there certain things people should understand about that process in order to be able to sell their business later?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So firstly, we sell a real range of businesses. So there's not a lot of people asking like, what's the perfect business or whatever, and there isn't really a perfect business. We've got like over 5,500 buyers. So chances are, if you have a business that's like solid, they're going to be interested. But generally speaking, our criteria we always look for businesses that are at least a year old, ideally older than that, but so at least shows an element of sustainability. We look for a business that can actually be taken over and sold. So let's say, for argument's sake, I owned thomassmale.com and my business was a podcast with me as the host, then regardless of how much money that podcast made, that would be a completely unsellable business. Darn
it, that's not good for me. I'm just kidding.
So that's the kind of thing we look at. And obviously, the buyers we deal with are looking at business as an investment. So we also look at the cash flow a business generates. We don't sell based on potential or anything like that. So a lot of people say, oh, my business is getting all this traffic, but no one's buying my product, but there's loads of potential there, which is not really something we deal with. It's just a very inconsistent way of doing things if we went down that route. But no, it's really just like age, can it be taken over, and how sustainable is it? So let's say, for argument's sake, you created a website that was Black Friday 2015, then chances are that business is only going to be relevant for one day ever. So regardless of how much it makes on Black Friday 2015, it probably doesn't have much resale value. But businesses like that don't come up too often. The business is seasonal, it's okay. But if for some reason it's got some finite end to it, whether that's like a year in the domain or something like that, then that's something we would avoid. But generally speaking, if the business is making money and can be taken over, then there's someone out there who's going to want to buy it. So I've always tried to remove the personal, whether or not I like business, or whether or not I would buy the business. And the focus that the team has is that business legitimate, rather than is that a business we either agree with or like ourselves, because lots of different buyers want different things.
Interesting. And so say I theoretically have a business which fits those criteria, or at least doesn't break any of them, and it's making, say, I guess, $10,000 per year. How do you evaluate the value of that business in terms of what price it could be sold at?
Yeah, so there are lots of different factors that come into valuation. We look at a lot of different variables. We probably look at subconsciously look at 100, 200 different factors with a business. But we're at the stage now where we've done coming up to 350 deals. So we've done a lot of deals, and chances are we've sold a similar business before. So what we tend to do is look at similar deals we've already completed, find out what they sold for, and then look at the comparable elements. And then from there, we can get a pretty good idea what buyers are saying. And we keep a lot of data and information from buyers about what they're saying about businesses and what their feedback is. So we can get a good idea where is there a certain industry where buyers are willing to pay more, to a certain industry where buyers don't want to pay as much. And it gets to a stage now where, from a valuation perspective, we're usually very accurate. I think our average deviation between initial valuation and final sales price is about 8 or 9% across the whole board. So generally speaking, we're very accurate. But there's no rule of thumb for multiples. A lot of people will say, oh, it's 2 times annual profit or 1.5 times revenue or whatever, which isn't. That will give you a general guideline, but there are far too many variables that go into it to be able to systemize it with just like a blanket multiple for every business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like a lot of your pricing strategy, at least now, comes from past experience. But I'm curious how you initially, for example, say it's the very first business that you sold within this company. How did you price it out then when you didn't have previous data points to look back on?
Yeah, so at the time, so now we're fortunate that we have a lot of our own data. But back when I first started, obviously I had zero distribution. Now we've got a list of 5,500 buyers, so it makes life a little bit easier than initially where I had no buyers. So initially we would use marketplaces like Flipper to get initial traction and initial buyers. This is back in 2010, 2011. And there are lots of comparable sales on there you could have looked at. So if you're not fortunate to have your own database, there are some sales out there. But at the time I was doing quite small deals, and it was really just a case of finding out what the seller wanted for a business, or trusting that the market will pay what a business is worth, which is quite a good way to look at it as well, because realistically we could list the business for any price we wanted, but a buyer's only ever going to pay what they think it's worth. It just so happens that now we have enough data on a consistent basis to figure out what a buyer will pay. But back then it was more of a case of seeing what the market would pay and trusting that the market would pay their price.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up Flipper, because I was actually thinking about this before, which is, I know there are a lot of differences, but I'm curious how you would describe the differences between, for example, what you and your business does and what Flipper does. And I know there's a couple other website sales platforms that I've seen before, but I'm sure it's there's different value propositions for each. So I'm curious how you guys differentiate yourself there.
Yes, I think the first differentiation is someone like Flipper is just a platform and a marketplace, whereas we are a full service brokerage. In terms of comparables, fee wise, most people think a broker will be a lot more than a marketplace. But if you list someone like Flipper, they're going to charge you a listing fee and then 10% on completion, and you have to do all of the work yourself. If you work with us, you don't pay us anything up front, and then you pay us 10 to 15% on completion, depending on the size. So cost wise is actually very comparable. I guess from a seller perspective, the one difference is that we don't take on every business that comes to us. Whereas on Flipper, I guess they let anybody list. There's no filter whatsoever. So the good business, bad business can be listed there. Whereas with us, we're going to be a little bit more selective. But in terms of process, we do everything for you. So if you come to us and you want to work to sell your business, our team will prepare usually about a 20-page prospectus on the business with various Q&A, financials, traffic stats in there, which we then go ahead and present to buyers. Obviously everywhere you go to sell a business is going to have buyers, but we build personal relationships with ours. We keep a lot of data. We meet a lot of them in person. We go to a lot of conferences. We speak at events. We do things like come on podcasts. We do a lot of guest posting, so that we have a lot of buyers who are very familiar with us and trust us, which certainly helps if someone's looking to buy a business for the first time. It's quite a daunting process. So working with a broker they can trust certainly helps, and that trust then generally means that we can get businesses sold for our clients, and ultimately our clients is always the seller, like get them a good deal. But I mean, we pretty much will do the whole process. So once we've prepared the sales materials, we go out and speak to buyers. We'll field the majority of Q&A. So we do a lot of it up front, and we'll kind of filter it out. Because if you list on a public marketplace, like Flipper or some of the slightly worse brokers, they'll effectively just send you through the Q&A raw, and you might have 100, 150 different buyers all asking the same questions. So that's something we deal with. We then work on the price negotiation as well. Because of all our kind of deal experience, we can usually get a pretty good idea what a business should sell for and what a good offer should look like. Because there are a lot of unscrupulous buyers out there who are trying to get deals that aren't particularly honest. So I guess one of the good things about brokers, you filter out any possibility of getting ripped off or like scammed by a buyer. And then, I mean, there are other things that are like very important from there that we do that a marketplace definitely doesn't. So things like contract drafting. We'll put together an asset purchase agreement for every single deal. It doesn't matter if it's a $20,000 site or a $2 million site. We prepare that. Some clients like to get their attorneys look over it or their lawyers. Others will kind of just trust in the agreement itself. And then we also help facilitate escrow and the transfer itself. So, I mean, the main thing is really just like the hands-on process you get throughout the whole thing. It's like real advice from a real person who actually does all the work for you, whereas a marketplace just facilitates you doing all of those things, but doesn't necessarily do it for you. And there are certain things that once we've done 300, 350 deals, preparing a sales contract is something to us that has relatively low time and cost commitment. But if you're doing a deal for the first time and you don't already have that in place, it might cost you $3,000 to $5,000 to get someone to write one out for you.
Economies of scale.
Yeah, so exactly. So that's the saving we'll offer straight away versus doing it yourself. So if you sold on a marketplace like Flipper, and then, I mean, a lot of people do deals without contracts, which you really shouldn't do. I know there are some brokers that do deals without contracts. Lots of deals on marketplaces happen without contracts. And that's just really not a very sensible way to do business. If you're selling like very small websites, say like $500 or $1,000, then maybe you can get away with it. But when we deal, our average sale is about 150,000. So it's very important you have a contract in place, even if it's just to avoid misunderstandings. A lot of people say, oh, there's no point in having a contract because you can't sue someone who's there, or you can't do this. But one of the main things I found with contracts is it's not necessarily the suing if there's a problem. It's to avoid any misunderstandings. So it clearly outlines everything that's included in the sale, what's expected of both parties, and then there's no confusion after the sale. So that's one thing that I think is very important. If you are ever going to sell a business, make sure you have a contract in place, regardless of whether you're working with a broker or trying to sell it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a whole bunch of really important points there. I do want to go back to one that you actually brought up a little bit ago about how you guys screen potential businesses that you're going to sell, especially because you get your money on the back end. So you have to put up all this time and energy and basically do all the work, and then you get sort of the financial payout on the back end. So I imagine you have to screen your potential clients and the businesses that you're going to try and sell quite intensely. And so I'm curious, do you have a specific process, like a criteria checklist? Because I imagine there are some people or some businesses which might match the general saleability criteria that we talked about before, but still may not be a good fit. And so I'm curious about how you go about determining that, because I think a lot of businesses out there have to go through that similar process of screening people to find the people that are really the good fit.
Yeah, so just like we go through a screening process with buyers to make sure that they're legitimate, we're exactly the same as sellers. And you're right. So when I started the business in the first place, one of the things I wanted to do was somewhat disrupt the brokerage industry, because traditionally business brokers will take on a lot of deals, but they don't really put that much effort into the deal. And quite rightly, they don't warrant the deals. They don't say, you can never guarantee anything is accurate. But brokers would take a very much backstep view of, we'll list the business and then we'll deal with questions as and when they come in. And that means that a traditional business broker has a success rate of about 20%. Whereas we're a lot more hands-on up front. We do a lot more vetting up front. That means our success rate is 93%.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time up front vetting. And while not every business is perfect, and I think anyone that tells you that would be lying. We do have like a very stringent process, and very few businesses make the cut. And that means on a consistent basis, if your business does get listed to us, then you've got through a lot of filters and buyers will respect that, meaning that our average sales prices can be a lot higher. Whereas if you list on someone like Flipper, you might have a really good business, but you're blended in with 100 really bad businesses. So you never really get, I guess, the exposure that your business deserves unless you're lucky. And the same goes for if you're with a slightly more traditional business broker. You'll see some brokers out there who have like 100 listings, but 5 brokers. And I can tell you it's impossible for one broker to have 20 listings and actually do a good job selling them. And in a situation like that, you're kind of relying on luck. Whereas myself and my business partner are not big believers in luck. So it's very much about process. So, I mean, some of the things we go through, I actually just wrote a blog post about this the other week. We look at, there's a number of factors, but we kind of break it down into 6 different elements of due diligence. So we look at traffic. Generally speaking, that would be a case of getting Google Analytics access and going through. And then I have a long list of things I'll look at depending on the business. Financials, obviously, like you're selling a business, it's very important to understand the numbers. We have a standardized format for the way we present financials. So regardless of how the sellers put them together, we always standardize it, whether that's them doing it or us doing it on their behalf. So consistency is kind of important there. We also look at the owner themselves. So one of the things we do up front, and one of the problems online is it's quite easy to remain completely private and not knowing who you're dealing with. Whereas we're quite big believers in transparency. If you're buying a business, while ultimately the owner is not going to stay with the business, you still need to be comfortable with them. So we do things like we'll look them up, we get an ID from them up front, make sure they're a real person. We then look at operational risks of the business, so figure out, so what I was talking about earlier, like is the business transferable? Is the owner a particular expert that's going to be quite hard to replace? We also look at technical due diligence in advance, so whether or not the business is on a platform that's easy to take over. So is it on something like WordPress, where there's absolutely tons of people that know about WordPress, or is it on some custom coded platform that only the owner knows about? And then we also look at legal, which is a little bit more of a grey area, but one thing we like to do, while we tend not to take an ethical stance on businesses, we do always like to ensure they're legal in most countries, so US, UK, Canada. We always look quite closely at trademarks and just making sure that they've properly sourced licensed images. There's no kind of outstanding lawsuits. They haven't stolen any content. So yeah, we break it down into those 6 things. Depending on the business itself, will kind of depend where our checks go. It's not like we have the same list that can be applied to every single business. But we do look in detail at everything we list. So it's very rare for a business we list not to sell. And generally speaking, if it doesn't sell, it's usually an issue with the seller. Maybe they're changing their mind. Maybe they've told us something that turns out not to be true. It's very rare. I can't remember where it's ever happened where we haven't got offers on the business.
You must be doing a good job then, if you get such a high success rate. I want to go back a second to one of the things you just said about how some businesses are based around an expert. Because something I observed, I bought an info product like 2 or 3 years ago, and I didn't look at it again recently until about 6 months ago. And I logged in and I noticed, it was an expert-based, very personally branded info product. And I was really fascinated by the fact that it had clearly the business had been sold, and then all of the videos had been re-recorded by a different person. And it was like the same kind of program. But it was just really interesting to me that could even happen, because I always assumed something that's very personally branded, like I'm the expert guru, here's my product. I was surprised that something like that could be sold. So that's just kind of an interesting anecdote. But apparently, sometimes even those businesses, there's some way to sell them. But yeah, that was a really interesting observation that I just stumbled across. There was another thing that I wanted to ask you about. So it sounds like you guys had a lot of successes. You guys are the big boys, the premium, high touch, hands-on, do it for you kind of offering. And you've seen a lot of success over the past 5 years. And I'm curious about, despite all of those successes, every business that's successful now has gone through some difficult times, either sort of more personally for the founders or the business as a whole. So I'm curious about a time, some kind of story or experience that you or your business had that was a low point, that you or your business felt like a failure, and then how you rebounded from that, because I think it's inevitable that we all go through that. So I'm curious about a time where that happened to you.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. That's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't like talking about. But I mean, over the years, we've been lucky that we have been very consistent. Of all the things that may have gone wrong in the background or problems we've had, we've always been very consistent in getting businesses sold. So our sales numbers go up every year. Every year our revenue's increasing. So we've never had any financial problems like that. But one of the problems we've had over the years for myself and my business partner, I think firstly running a business is very stressful. We offer a very high level service, and we're very, I wouldn't call it strict, but we're very adamant, both myself and Ismail, that the service we offer is of high quality, and it's always important to us that our clients get a good service. So I guess that adds an element of stress that isn't necessarily there in a business where you don't really care so much about the product or service you're offering. I think one of the biggest challenges we've had between the two of us has been hiring and expanding and scaling, because of the nature and the very specialized nature of the service. While we've got to the stage now where we've got a great team in place, we definitely had some growing pains initially where we were hiring people and they didn't turn out to be a good fit, so we had to fire them. And that's quite challenging, I think, from, I guess, a young business owner perspective. I think both of us found it quite challenging to thinking we'd hired the right people, but then getting to the stage where realizing where they're not quite a good fit to get the business the way we want it to be. And they also didn't share our same attitude to customer service, because we're always very much a customer first business. And if we've got kind of people who are more interested in, for example, going home on time than doing that last call with a client when they're kind of getting a little bit worried about their deal or something like that, then that's not something we want in the team. And I think just being both myself and my business partner both did a business degree at university, or a good university in the UK, one of the best business courses in the country, but it never really prepares you for the difficulties that go into hiring and hiring the right people and training them right. So that's always been a consistent challenge for us. So gradually we're learning, but it's very much one of those things you learn as you go along. But overall, from a business perspective, I think we've been quite lucky that the business we've always made money. We've consistently made revenue. We've always had a good service. It's had a good reputation. So we've never really had any issues with a situation where lots of clients were complaining at once, or people started leaving negative reviews about us or anything like that. So I'm very grateful for that sort of thing.
Nice. And so to recap, your biggest consistent struggles with hiring those rock stars, finding that good support and people to bring onto your team that share your vision and your work ethic. So I'm curious what strategies have evolved for you over the past 5 years to actually try and find those people more accurately. And I say more accurately because, of course, just like you can't probably successfully sell every single business that exists that comes to you, you're never going to hire 100% accurately either. But I'm curious how your processes for that have evolved over time to become more accurate in finding those quality hires.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one because we've found, as a very small business, well, I guess we're not quite so small anymore, but initially a lot of the jobs we were hiring or the roles we were hiring didn't previously exist. So, for example, starting a marketing department, starting a brokerage department, starting finance department, starting a legal department, starting a technical department, whereas previously it'd be, say, two of us doing a bit of everything ourselves and then getting freelancers involved. Very much been every single time someone's come in, they're coming into a brand new role. It's not like a big company where you go into an established role that's been there. There's a management hierarchy and all of that. So I think over time it's just the fact the role itself has matured for a lot of the different things we've hired. So now we can bring in a new broker, for example, and we've had brokers who work for us at the moment, so we know what's expected of them. And with the brokers, obviously they're quite target driven and commission driven. So we can set quite reasonable targets based on what we know that other people in the team have done before. Whereas starting out, one of the challenges we had was what should someone's target be? What should we pay them? So that caused quite a few issues initially is that we just didn't know what someone should be able to sell in 3 months or 12 months. So it's just a case of the longer you are in business, the more data you have to kind of support the targets you have. And we've always been quite target driven, but it's important that people have realistic targets to hit. We've always found that every single time we've hired for a new role, regardless of how much thought into it, we've always got the initial targets completely wrong. Like our judgment on it. But then as time's gone on, it's been a case of that. Another thing we've done, one of the difficulties hiring in a small business is, so a lot of people in the world of employment want a job with a big company, and those who want to work for a smaller company tend to want to work for a funded startup. So I think being a small business run by, so my business partner and I are both 27, run by relatively young guys in a relatively unknown industry, has always been quite difficult to attract talent. So we've been quite lucky that we tend to have tapped into our referral network, so kind of friends of friends and things like that. And while we've always tried to avoid hiring friends, we like to hire people who have come off recommendations and we know that we can trust, and also that they trust us. Because ultimately, coming to work for a small business, you've got to have a lot of faith in there's two guys at the top who are like ultimately running the show and driving the ship. So that's very important, and that trust certainly helps if they do come off the back of a referral. But that's one of those things that now we're at 10 people, it's quite difficult to keep tapping into that. And we're now getting to the stage where we need to start hiring people who don't already know who we are, and they're kind of starting from nowhere.
So friends are bad, but friends of friends are good. That's really interesting. And I liked how you brought up the comparison between your type of business and the funded kind of startup type business. Because I think nowadays, a lot of people, when they think about, small businesses, like the idea of a startup is very intimately tied to their perspective of that, because that's what is always like in the news and it's really flashy. So that's really interesting that that's made it more difficult for you to hire, because some all-star hires might expect to be part of a funded startup. And I've seen that as well. My peer group and other people, like the really talented people oftentimes do gravitate towards startups, which is interesting. And I'm not really entirely sure why that is, to be honest, but it's interesting to hear that it's happened for you as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I've always been, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm anti-startup, but I mean, while we're still a relatively small business, we're still 5 years old, we've made money every year, we've made more money every year, we've always been profitable. So from a actual risk perspective, we're probably actually very safe to work for. You could go work for a really big company who could start making layoffs, and they might get rid of 20,000 people, and to them, you're just a number. Whereas with us, we've always been quite conservative about hiring. We've never overstretched ourselves, so we've never run ourselves into debt or anything like that, hiring people we can't afford. So I think actually people, if they are looking for jobs, should seriously look at small businesses that can offer a lot more stability, and ultimately you're not just going to be a number to them, they're actually going to care about you a lot more. And with startups more like gambling. You never really know. A lot of startups will be pre-revenue, might have got a lot of funding, so you might know your job's going to be safe for a couple of years, but you've got no idea how well that company's going to perform. Whereas if you join a small business that's been around for a number of years, I think it's usually fair to assume that it's going to continue growing, as long as you believe in kind of the vision of the company and also the culture. Because I think one of the things I like personally about running my own business is, regardless of all the ups and downs that you inevitably have, is ultimately you're offering a service that you believe in. And I generally feel like the service you offer is good. I like to think that I would love to be a client of our business. I feel like what we offer is great, whereas I think you can work in a lot of big companies that might be morally or ethically quite borderline in a lot of areas, and I don't think I would quite believe in their vision. And a lot of startups are the same. I think it's important to find somewhere that actually interests you and you can kind of believe in what they do and what they're trying to do to an industry, rather than just getting to make money or whatever, like a lot of startups might be.
That's actually a really good heuristic, is to ask yourself, okay, would I actually want to be my own client? Would I actually hire my own company if I needed this service? I like that a lot. And it sounds like you've learned a ton of lessons over the past 5 years and through all of your successes. And so I'm curious, as a result of those lessons that you've learned, if you somehow were to start over from scratch, how would you start over given what you know now?
I think like one of the first things I would do is try and build one of the mistakes I made initially, whether that's inevitable or not, was building a service that was effectively me from day one. And I always thought, I was the best in the world at doing it. It's only going to work if it's just me. But I realized over time that ultimately I'm not the best person. There are lots of very intelligent people out there. I'm lucky that most of my team, all of the team, do a great job at things that I can't necessarily do myself. So one of the things I would have done from day one, and one of the things I'm kind of still dealing with now, is the kind of effect of my own kind of, not necessarily failings, but things like I'm not a very systemized person. I don't really follow like processes myself. And it's much harder to change things and fix bad habits when you're 4 or 5 years in and have like a mature product or service offering. So I think from day one, I would have worked on something that's process systemized, building SOPs that can be followed from day one and ideally followed by anyone. And I think that's important because I'm at the stage now where I spend a lot of time just fixing the fact that I did things wrong quite early on. And it's always quite difficult. Like hindsight's a wonderful thing when it comes to figuring out what you should have done. But I know if I started saying again, I would definitely look at building systems, processes from day one.
So even though you were resistant to doing that initially, you have gotten around to it, but I'm curious how long it took you to flip that switch, to actually get away from that perspective that it has to be you and actually focus on building those SOPs and those processes and that team. How long did it take you to make that switch?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I think when I got like 2 years into the business, so towards the end of 2012, this is when Ismail, my current business partner, came in. I'd known Ismail for years, since university. So I guess we did the don't go into business for a friend thing, and we did that, and thankfully we haven't killed each other just yet.
Just yet.
But I kind of, one of the reasons I wanted him to join is because I realized there were a lot of things that I didn't have or wouldn't be able to do myself, and I'd recognized the fact that I'd effectively built a business around myself, and that's not what I wanted to do. So I guess he effectively came in as a troubleshooter, and a lot of his time now, I'm sure if you interviewed him, who tell you a lot more about this, but a lot of his time now is just spent sorting me out and helping me improve myself and my processes, and kind of making sure that we can replicate what I do in a slightly more scalable and replaceable way. Because just if when we look at businesses where it's quite replaceable. If you look at F International 3 years ago, we really didn't have that. So I'd love to take the credit for doing all that, but I mean, it's really Ismail who's kind of come in and fixed all those things and got to the stage now where, I mean, we still both work very hard, but I mean, a lot of the business kind of runs without us now. We've got a good team who can do a lot of things. So.
Teams and systems. Coming back to that same thing, I think if we had a 3 bullet point list, because I like bullet point lists, it's teams, systems, and have a really, really great service. And that's the formula for a really great business. Yeah,
I do think a lot of people, I think a lot of people do actually forget that final thing. You get a lot of people who, so while I do think that's something I would have focused on from day one, you've still ultimately got to make sure you have a good product or service. And like I said, I think maybe you're right that having a product service that you'd be happy to buy yourself, genuinely, obviously a lot of people say they would happily buy the service, but I generally feel that is the case. I generally feel like we have the best service and offer the best service in the industry. So I think that is ultimately important, especially if you want a sustainable business and you're not going to take on funding or anything like that. You've got to ultimately have a service that's going to consistently deliver, because you can have the best systems, processes, and team in the world, but if your product sucks or your service sucks, then you're not going to be around very long.
That's great, man. Words of wisdoms, and you're building something that you can be proud of. It's really great. So now I'd like to, as we finish up this interview, I'd like to have sort of a rapid fire set of questions. And so I got 3 questions for you, and if you could try and answer in 1 sentence or less, that'd be great. So are you ready for this?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, number 1, what's something that you're really good at and better than most people? What's your signature strength?
I would say intuition when it comes to analyzing a business.
Interesting answer. Now, what's number 2? What's something that you're really, really bad at, actually much worse than most people?
My attention span is horrendous.
ADD. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And number 3, what's something that you're most excited about right now in your business, in your life, and the next steps that you have to take?
Trying to scale from our current $1 million a year in revenue to 10 million.
That would get me excited too. It's a pretty exciting goal. So nice. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to have this interview. I think you've shared a lot of valuable insights, and I think hearing from somebody who's achieved such a great business model with a great service, especially at a young age. I didn't realize you were 27. That's awesome. And so if there's anything that you want to share in terms of any URLs, like what website would you like people to go to check out what you're doing, and maybe if they want to get in touch with you or just pay attention to what you're doing, where should they go?
So our main website is feinternational.com. And one of the things that I would recommend, whether or not you either like looking to buy a business, sell a business, or even if you're just running a business and you're kind of curious about the process, a lot of people we deal with aren't necessarily thinking about selling now. If you go onto our website, you can download we've got a free guide to buying an online business. So that's quite a relevant read put together by David and James from our brokerage team. Download that, have a read, and you get a pretty good idea of system and process we have. Or you can just go on the website, browse around. We've got a blog which updates each week, so read some articles in there, or check out what we do. But I can send you a couple of URLs afterwards, so you can link directly to the white pages.
Yeah, sounds great. Happy to do that on the show notes of the page. And so you guys heard it here. If you're listening now and you're interested in hiring and becoming a client of a really established high-end service to make sure that you successfully sell your business in the right way, legitimately, you don't get scammed, go check out feinternational.com. And thanks again for joining me today, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Juan. Really appreciate it.
Hey entrepreneurs and experts, I just wanted to thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you learned at least one new big idea that helps you evolve your skills and gets you closer to monetizing your expertise and creating that successful knowledge business. Make sure to hit that subscribe button on iTunes and Stitcher, and check out myepodcast.com for all episodes as well as the tips and tricks mentioned in this episode. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.